hear it now. I can hear it now. I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now.
All right. So for today's Heartbeat episode, we've got PhD statistician Regina Wattiel. And if you're not familiar with her book, I'll throw up a copy of what it looks like, and it's called Fissman's Fraud. And the book was basically around Fissman's study that the Liberal government paid for in order to rationalize the mandates to keep people locked down and for us to keep using the Arrive Scam app, the $80,000 investment that ballooned into $60 million of more fraud by the Liberal government. So thanks for taking some time with me here today, Regina. It's great to see you again. Great to talk to you again. Why don't you lead into a little bit about, what you covered inside of your book, who David Fissman is, and why the government relied so heavily on this information. I mean, they didn't really, because it was only, I believe, read into the House once by Adam Kevorkian, Dr. Kevorkian from BC, he's a Liberal or NDP MP. So it was only talked about once. There was only one guy brave enough, only one guy with the brass, or only one guy stupid enough to even try and pull the wool over Canadians' eyes with this fraudulent data that Fissman threw out in front of us. So take it away, Regina.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for having me on your show here today, Sheldon. I really appreciate it, and I always enjoy our conversations. So thank you. I guess I should start by talking a little bit about who Dr. Fissman is. So Dr. Fissman is an epidemiologist and a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. He's also a physician of internal medicine. So he has his MD. And he has been, I describe him as Canada's frontman for pandemic modeling. So he's been a strong advocate for all harsh government measures during the pandemic, from lockdowns to school closures to mask mandates to vaccine mandates, travel restrictions, all of them. He was part of the Ontario Science Table here, and he did advise all levels of government, from municipal to provincial to federal, and he's very well connected. Another thing that's very important about Dr. Fissman is he has a lot of connections to pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and the lot. He's been on a lot of advisory boards throughout the pandemic to advise, like the Ontario Teachers Federation, and the nursing associations, that type of thing. So he's played a very prominent role during the pandemic.
So he sounds pretty accredited. He's a doctor, an epidemiologist.
Yeah.
Is he a statistician?
No.
No.
He's an epidemiologist. He does create models. Not all his models are statistical models. He does a lot of model simulations that are just deterministic models. I do wonder a little bit about his, well, I won't go there, but he's an epidemiologist and he's not a statistician. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I don't want you to get in any trouble by slandering him. I mean, we want to keep this on the up and up. And I mean, you outright called him a fraud in your book. This has now been introduced into the House of Commons as well.
It has, which is great, actually.
And you would think when you call somebody a fraud, or when you call one of the reports a fraud, you think that there would be some sort of action that would be taken against you. You don't. I mean, if somebody called me a fraud, unless I knew that I was doing something fraudulent, I'd probably have some pretty spicy words, or I'd at least react to it. To your knowledge, has David actually reacted to being called a fraud, or having his report called fraudulent?
Yeah. So I call what my book does is that it discusses the scientific fraud that he conducted. So I don't say Fissman, I don't call him a fraud, but I call what he engaged in scientific fraud. And it does satisfy the literal definition of scientific fraud. So that is why I use the word fraud, because that is the definition, what he did. Um, and nobody has come after me saying any different. And nobody's, I mean, there hasn't been really anyone countering what I've said. So that's been interesting over the last few months. Fisman does know about it. He did tweet about it in his Twitter or his X. So I know he's aware, and it would be hard not to be aware. But so far, no action has been taken against my work, and I'm not sure what they could do about it because it's all verifiable. So I should probably discuss a little bit what he actually did in terms of fraud and how it was used and that sort of thing. So with what Fisman did, the specific study that I talk about in my book was actually written in April of 2022. So this is months after the Omicron wave. So at this time, we had already had things like the Freedom Convoy that was in January, where there's a big protest against the mandates. And at that time, if you look at the Government of Ontario data at that time, it actually showed that vaccinated individuals had higher COVID rates than unvaccinated individuals. And yet the mandates still were on in January, and the rhetoric against the unvaccinated actually ramped up. And the federal government, as you recall, in January also brought in even more restrictions against unvaccinated, namely the unvaccinated truckers. So that was all going on in January during the Omicron wave. That extra restrictions on unvaccinated truckers, that sparked the Freedom Convoy. And the Freedom Convoy put a lot of pressure on the provinces to relent on their vaccine passports and the federal government to relent on its vaccine mandates and travel restrictions. And it was working. Towards the early in February, the provinces began to one by one relent on their passports. And at that point, in an act of desperation, the federal government imposed the Emergencies Act because, well, they were desperate, and it was clear they did not want to relent on their mandates and passports, their mandates and travel restrictions. But there was a lot of pressure still on the federal government to do so. And so they were in desperate need of science, and that's when Fisman's study comes in. So Fisman basically concocted a model to simulate fake data that showed the reverse of what the real data showed. So fake data that showed that the unvaccinated had higher incident rates and that they were a disproportionate risk to others. And the big issue with Fisman's study is that he tried to pass it off as fact, as a true reflection of what was happening. And media ran with it. So it was broadcasted across Canada and actually across the globe, warning of the risks of merely hanging out with unvaccinated Canadians. And it was waved around in Parliament in the House of Commons by, I think it was Adam Van Koeverden, waved it around, basically using it as justifications to extend the travel restrictions. So it was used in Parliament. It was put on the record. And it was clear that it was done to scapegoat unvaccinated Canadians and to prop up vaccine mandates, passports, and restrictions. He says that right in his study. So that's how it was used.
And what we'd seen is at that time, I think the Conservative Party of Canada, the federal party, was just going through a leadership. They'd fired O'Toole because he'd lost what had to have been the most easily winnable election in the history of Canada. And he lost. How he managed to lose that, I could only describe it as being purposeful. So yeah, we had interim leader Candice Bergen at the time, and they were going through this. I think Candice Bergen did a pretty good job at with all the other conservatives, and they were screaming, "Show us the science." Because everybody kept asking, like, what is this science that you're talking about? Because Justin Trudeau and the Liberals kept saying, we're relying on the best science that's available. And when they kept asking, "Where's the science? Where's the science? Where's the science?" they finally came out with this fraudulent report that wasn't an actual reflection of the data that we were seeing. It was based on model quality data, which was 100% wrong throughout the entire pandemic. I mean, the early days of the, in 2020, they'd always have these projections, and they would use them to force people to stay or scare people into staying home, staying locked down, right?
Right. So with David's model, it was completely fabricated. Like there was no ties whatsoever to real data. So he just made it up. And it was completely deterministic. So whatever you fed into the model, it gave you what you wanted. So it was meant to give that result. And passing it off as a true reflection of of events, that's fabrication. And like you said, the fact that it was opposite to real world data, and it was real world data was readily available, and they chose not to use it and not to acknowledge it, that's actually considered falsification. And he knew about the Ontario data. He's used the Ontario data in the past. He was told by, like, a lot of scientists complained about this study. A lot of scientists asked for corrections, a retraction of the paper. A lot of us wrote to the journal. They refused to retract the paper, and the researchers refused to make the corrections, the necessary corrections. So that's why I went the extra mile, because I realized what it was being used for. It wasn't just to prop up past mandates. It was to set the stage for future mandates. When you look at what Fisman writes in a lot of the interviews that he conducted afterwards, he basically says that his study undermines the notion that vaccine choice is best left to the individual. And that's what it was all about. It was about setting the stage for looking at vaccination differently, that as a something that should be done for the community and something that really shouldn't be left up to the individual. So the problem with that is that the real data, well, the problem is it's unethical, but also the real data show that that wasn't the case, and it actually proves that the underlying premise is wrong. So if we look at the real world data and look at what Fisman and his colleagues tried to do, it actually shows the opposite, in that the government should never have mandated it and should not have the right to take that choice away from us. So I think this is why there's they're hesitant to retract this model and hesitant to retract this study, because then they admit that that premise is wrong and that they were willing to resort to fraud to to push it.
Well, let's talk about real world implications of this, though. I mean, being locked down, it was terrible. I mean, we couldn't go and sit in restaurants, couldn't fly, take public transport. Like, there was a lot of that went on. Even inside, like, at Christmas, around that time, uh, we'd go into a shopping mall. You could buy something at the food court, but the food court was all plexiglassed off for the vaccinated people. So it created that that two-tiered society based on not actual health, but on medical decisions. But what I'm more so concerned about with is, if the government said, take this pill and it'll make you fly, and then people just went to an edge of a cliff, took the pill and jumped off of it and died, that would be a terrible thing to do. And that's basically what the government did, is they told people, if you took this shot, you would be safe from COVID. And then they let them travel. Then they let them go overseas, where they caught COVID, came back to Canada, and died from it. Like, that seems to be reckless disregard for human life. They promised something that they couldn't deliver. They knew it was absolutely false. So I mean, like, not to forget about the people that were locked down, me being one of them. I still haven't taken any of the COVID vaccines. But what about the lives that this actually caused?
Well, that's the thing. This fraud didn't just impact the unvaccinated, it impacted everybody. So for the unvaccinated, it was actually, basically trying to justify extortion, right? Take these vaccines or injections, or you lose your job, or you don't travel, or you go to public venues. So there was, it was basically used to justify extorting people. On the other hand, with the people who did take this, there was coercion. You know, you're doing it to save grandma, you're doing it to help society and to protect the vulnerable. And so they were doing it. Many people did it for that reason because they thought it was the right thing to do, and the government convinced them it was the right thing to do, and they didn't see the risks in taking it because it was promised to be, you know, safe. And that's the thing, because so many people took it, because, you know, billions of people took this drug, there's this false sense that it must be safe because everybody's taking it. And I think, yeah, it's quite sad. But yeah, everybody was affected by the fraud.
Yeah,
But
and
more
that
than that,
and like I said, the false sense of security that a lot of people gain by this. You
well,
know,
there's a false sense.
we have people that are ill that got the jabs thinking, oh, well, I'm safe now. I'm bulletproof. They go out into these public spaces. And then we heard about these super spreader events where it was only the vaccinated that were allowed. And even if we look at Omicron, Omicron had to come into the country in somebody that was vaccinated, in several people that were vaccinated. So the largest spike wave of COVID that we'd seen in the entire country came in on people that were vaccinated because they were told that they were safe and that they couldn't catch COVID.
Right. So we knew well before mandates, like in the summer of 2021, before the mandates, before the passports, before the travel restrictions, back in Delta, we knew that these vaccines did not stop transmission, and even their ability to curtail it at all was in question because we had massive outbreaks in mostly vaccinated venues, for example, in the United States. So these venues, it was mostly vaccinated people, and there was huge outbreaks. Also in the summer of 2021, we've seen a resurgence in Israel. Israel was the first country to vaccinate the majority of its population. And in June, July, August of 2021, they were seeing a resurgence. They went ahead and approved their third dose, and they warned all the other countries that 2 doses wouldn't be enough. So that was all before the mandates were put in place. So we knew early. It wasn't just Omicron. But when Omicron hit, it became absolutely obvious. At that point, you've locked down a good portion of your, well, you locked down basically the unvaccinated. They couldn't travel. A lot of them were purged from their workplace. Um, you had restrictions in terms of public venues. And with 80% of your population vaccinated, poof, you get Omicron, these record surges to 5 times previous levels. So it was absurd at that point that mandates would continue. I mean, you know, I look at the graphs of Omicron during, you know, like all the way leading up to Omicron. And when I see Omicron hit, it's almost like Mother Nature giving the politicians and their faux science the middle finger. That's what it looked like. It's so bad. But instead of admitting failure, they doubled down. They doubled down on their hateful rhetoric, and they tried to blame the small portion of unvaccinated people for these record surges. But all their data showed the very opposite. So it was clearly scapegoating. The science was not on their side at all, and it hadn't been since the beginning. And you know, it just goes from there. What happened during Omicron was that the data was so bad. It was so bad they could no longer manipulate it to make it look good. So you get outright fabrication. It's like, oh, this looks so bad, we may as well make the whole thing up. And that's basically what Fisman and his colleagues did. The real issue, well, that's bad enough, but the real issue would be what was that it was backed by the establishment. It was backed by this journal. They knew. It was backed by the University of Toronto. It was funded by the federal government through CIHR. And when I wrote to all these entities, showed absolute proof, asked for retraction, they stood by that study, despite the fact it was a clear case of scientific fraud. And I think that's the real crux of the matter here. It's not just Fisman. It's not just his colleagues. It's top institutions went along with fraud.
I don't think it's just the fraud on that because you know, we did talk about that safe aspect of it. You know, it was supposed to be safe and effective. Well, we've already busted into the fact that it wasn't that effective. But let's dig into some of the safety here, and I can pull these up and just kind of show them in the video. I'll do that in the editing portion. But right now in Canada, there is 50, what is it? This is tests, current situation. So there's 58,972 deaths, and that's up to March 26th. So that's current to a couple of days ago.
So you're
For
talking
the
COVID deaths.
COVID associated mortalities.
COVID, yeah. So what they call COVID deaths, which is dying with, not from COVID, but with it. Yeah.
And yeah, and I kind of go through that a couple of times too, because there is no actual definition that Health Canada has been able to provide of what a COVID death is. It's something that kind of mimics what COVID symptoms might be, and and they go through this PCR testing, and what we know from the University of Winnipeg is that PCR testing can detect COVID inside of somebody for up to 100 days. And the only true way to say if the person had COVID, live COVID in them, that it may have impacted their health, is if they did live cultures. And that was never done.
Well,
So,
yeah, yeah. It's purposeful not to do it, right? And also COVID deaths itself, it would be hard for them to give a definition since it changes over time. It was, dying with COVID, not particularly because of COVID or from COVID, but after Omicron, there was, it looked really bad. And at that point, they started getting concerned about incidental deaths, right? People who didn't really die because of COVID, they just happened to have it when they died of something else. And that they were willing to ignore that. It looked like to a large extent, they were willing to ignore those incidental deaths before Omicron, but after Omicron, it became problematic because it made the vaccines look bad. So at that time, there seemed to be a little bit more effort to take away some of the incidental deaths so it didn't look as bad. So there's this, they tend to change things depending on how good or bad it looks for their narrative.
and I believe that because when we'd seen, the mortalities from 2020, it was X, and then 2021 got worse, and then 2022 was the highest year for mortality associated to COVID of all the years. And this is when people were already in their third and fourth jab. So I don't think that we're seeing a true reflection of the data. And Health Canada, instead of just lying about it, had removed those vaccinated statistics, the breakdown of mortality by their number of jabs, because they could no longer hide what they couldn't keep telling people that unvaccinated were dying when it was clear the vaccinated were dying in greater amounts. And even when the people that had taken the booster jabs, when the mortality of that superseded the people that were fully vaccinated, so only had the 2 jab protocol, it was more than clear that these things weren't saving people. But again, on the injury side of things, and the statistics haven't been updated on injuries since January 5th. So where the mortality is current in Canada at 58,972, I think that was the number. Let me just verify that. Yeah, 58,972 COVID associated mortalities. That's up to current, whereas 58,712 people were injured by the jabs. 11,702 of them with life-altering serious adverse events. And that's only up to January. So it's only this month, and this is after 3 full years of the vaccinations being rolled out, that COVID mortality is now in excess of vaccine injury. But they had to stop counting the vaccine injuries and continue to count the COVID mortalities in order to rationalize the data. And they say, there's 105 million doses, but only 58,712 injuries. And I look at that and I say, well, that's really stupid, because everybody says the same thing. Look at how many of these vaccines were given. It's a very small percentage. The problem with this is there's only now 41 million people in the country. It's not 105, and 100% of the people weren't vaccinated. So when I look at the way they look at this, I say, well, if we did the same thing with cigarettes and counted every cigarette that somebody smoked, the cigarette smoking actually comes out to be safer than the vaccines, in that, you take somebody that smoked cigarettes for 25 years, a pack a day, that's 25 cigarettes, and they don't get cancer or they don't get cancer until 25 years after. Now, we don't know what cigarette caused that, what individual, where the camel's back broke on that one straw. But I mean, if you take 25 years of 365 days of 25 cigarettes in a pack, and then you find out that only one of those probably caused the cancer, then they look really, really safe. So when we look at the injuries, statistically speaking, it's another fraud that they're committing on people and trying to say that they're safe, breaking it down like this, isn't it?
Well, they're trying to minimize the safety issues, right? They're trying to so they're going to do whatever they can to make these things look as safe as they can, and that means creating a narrative around it, right? So you talked about COVID deaths, and what should always be mentioned when you talk about COVID deaths is the fact that, well over 90% of those deaths, they had comorbid conditions, and it basically, impacted the very, very elderly, and a good portion of those deaths, I'm not sure, is the mean used to be over 80 years old, right? So you're looking at the very old, and you're looking at several comorbid conditions. Over 90% of the people, at least one, at least one comorbid condition. Now you're looking at vaccine injury, and what's the distribution look like there? Is it also just impacting the elderly, or is now we're seeing the vaccine injured amongst young people that had no real, no significant risk from COVID itself? So you have to look at who it's impacting as well, right? So the vaccine injury, well, that's across the board, and that's very sad. And people suffered injury that really did not need to take these vaccines at all. And so you're right. You have to look at the context. To say you gave out 105 million doses in Canada when that's silly. I mean, like you said, there's only like around 40 million people in Canada. So why are you looking at 105? And people, does it make them feel better if, like when you got injured? If you got injured, you're you're injured, whether it's from your first dose, second dose, third dose, you're injured just the same. You're it doesn't make it any better if it's your third dose versus your first. So I'm not sure why they're trying to lead people down that path, except to obviously minimize the harm of these vaccines that their vaccines are causing.
I'm going to pull up a screen real quick here. I'm going to share the vaccine injury table here, so everybody can kind of have a look at this, and we'll just discuss this for a quick second. Can you see what I'm looking at here?
Ah, yes.
So this is the number of adverse events, and this is by age. And what it
Yeah.
looks like is it looks like, not too many in the 0 to 4s, and then it kind of peaks at the 40 to 49s. And then when we get to the, past that, is the injuries seemingly go down, right? So we've got like this bell-shaped curve on this. So I'm going to pull this off now.
Well, I'll look at that for a second, Sheldon, because you look at this bell-shaped curve, and so there's several things. Like I had previously mentioned, when you look at COVID deaths, they're heavy on the 70 plus, right? Especially 80 plus.
Yep.
And this curve, you see the adverse events are bell-shaped with the greatest number right in the middle there, the middle-aged. But this is also, these are reported adverse events. So I do wonder like how that factors by age, because the elderly generally do have several comorbid conditions, and who knows if their vaccine injuries get reported or just get, misclassified as something else.
Well, there's a couple of things that are at play there. We have that the tiniest amount of adverse reactions is in the tiniest population, the youngest population,
Yeah.
which is the
But
0 to 4. And the one of the questions that I'd always ask is, how does a 2-year-old communicate that their chest hurts?
mhm.
They don't have the ability to communicate. So how do we know that there's the testing that was done, or the reporting that was done on the vaccine injuries? It was considered a passive system, or it's called a passive system, which means you have to have symptoms and then go into your doctor and then be diagnosed. At the same time as this is going on, is doctors' offices were shut down, and people couldn't go to their doctor and even get tested for what could be considered vaccine injuries. The other side of it is in those 60 to 80, where it starts to really slope down, is the definition of vaccine injuries. We're kind of specific to if somebody already had, let's call it damaged heart. And, in 80 years, you're 80 years old. You've had 80 years of use on your heart. Of course, there's going to be, some injury there. Well, if you got more injuries from the vaccine, if it worsened a pre-existing condition, it wasn't considered. The other side of things is in those age groups is those are the highest age groups that are taking blood thinners. So they're already taking medications to mitigate the injury that's being caused in the rest of the population. There was, and they talked about ivermectin and, called it horse paste and said we shouldn't be repurposing these harmful drugs. But at the same time, after the jabs had rolled out, and I believe it was in August of 2021, they said one of the things that could help, reduce the symptoms of COVID was taking blood thinners. And with that, I'd gone in, and Health Canada has a page where you can dig into, what prescriptions we were short of at that time. And as it turns out, there was a global shortage on one of the most commonly prescribed blood thinners. Global shortage following vaccinations of blood thinners. And then there's something like aspirin. Now, people even my age, in their early 50s, are taking, the low dose aspirin because they heard about, it's good for your heart, or, can keep you from having a heart attack or whatever. So I know a lot of people take this low dose aspirin, which basically does the same thing. It mitigates the damages that we could see by the jabs. And then there's one more thing, is that if somebody was on these other prescriptions and these other prescriptions had a side effect that was similar to what the vaccines had, it was considered an adverse reaction to the other prescriptions. It wasn't considered an adverse reaction to the COVID jabs. So they looked for everything possible to try and say that these things didn't harm people. They shut down doctors' ability to even assess patients. And inside of that, only after a full 3 years of these things being rolled out with 2 months of lagging data on injuries, has COVID-associated mortalities superseded vaccine injuries. To me, it just blows my mind.
Oh yeah. There's been a huge effort to understate the vaccine adverse events, right? Even people who try to report haven't been able to. So there's a lot of issues with the reporting. There's clear underreporting of the adverse events. When you look at the data, you mentioned a lot of the reliability problems. You mentioned how it's not representing the true extent of the injury. But what it does show is that it's not just affecting a specific group. You do see a lot of injury across the board. It does seem to be centered in the middle age, but there's a lot of reporting issues with that. But that's very, very different than when you look at the risk of COVID. So, and that needs to be discussed.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. And yeah, like you said, there was some difficulty, even in reporting, and a portion of that was even handled by the provincial restrictions on reporting. So if you diagnose a patient, you only have 3 days inside of that initial diagnosis to say if it was a vaccine injury or not. 3 days. So somebody has a reaction, let's call it myocarditis. You go through this testing phase, you realize this is what it is. You've only got 3 days to get that reported, and from what I'd understood is these systems for reporting, they were difficult. There was a lot of paperwork. Doctors were reluctant to do this, and and I've talked to a lot of people that said, well, my doctor just wouldn't report my injuries.
Yeah, I hear the same thing, and my sister actually worked in a cardiology unit. She was a a technician, and the doctors there, when she asked them, "Hey, how are you reporting these? What's the process for reporting?" They had no clue. And when patients came and said, "I think this is because of the vaccine," they were, they were kind of shoved off, like, "Nope, nope, we're not going to go there. They're safe." So that was within these you know, when you look at doctors not really willing to report them or being hesitant to report them, there's going to be a massive amount of undercounting. But that's what it's all about. Like, it's impossible to say, like, it's, how do I phrase it? It's very, very, very clear they do not want to report vaccine injury, and there's an effort to not look. And if you don't look, you can say, "I didn't find it," because you didn't look. So it makes things easier.
Yeah, you'll never find what you're not looking for.
Right. And so that's why they like to say there's no evidence of. It's like, well, actually, there's actually quite a bit of evidence now that's not looking good when it comes to vaccine safety. But that favorite line is, "There's no evidence of," and then they make a huge effort not to collect the evidence. It's
Yeah.
insane that they get away with it for now.
Not only trying to not collect it, but also not reporting on what we're actually seeing. So you can't get a breakdown on the number of deaths per vaccine anymore. So you used to be able to get it after the first jab, after the second, then they went into, after the boosters, and then there was a 4 or more. And that's basically when they cut it off, because there were still deaths being reported. So when these people say, well, the vaccines worked, well, which jab worked? Because people died after each one of the consecutive jabs. So if it was the fourth one that worked, then why were people still dying? If it was the fifth one that worked, then why were people still dying? We're now on, if people followed the protocols, the every 3 months, 6 months. I mean, they changed these things so much. Quebec even has altered their statistics on the
Yeah.
on the database, because their definition of fully vaccinated is now 3. So they've actually pulled their mortalities. You can see the discrepancy in the age associated versus the actual totals, and that's because those ones were completely erased. But on the age side, because this is something that we talked about, you said the majority of the injuries seem to be in that bell curve, in the highest in the 40 to 49, and the most of the majority of people that had died were in that 80 plus. I mean, throughout the years consecutively, I think it's been 82 to 83 is the average age mortality associated with COVID. And, we'll just kind of leave it at with from. And the thing about that is, and when I dug into this, I was actually led some breadcrumbs by a couple of nurses that I'd met at one of the rallies. Great gals, but absolutely would not come on camera, because they were still with Alberta Health Services, and they didn't want to risk anything. So I said, like, we'll mask your voices. We'll put no camera. Like, we'll do the whole deep throat reporting type on this. And they were so afraid. But they said, this is what you have to look at, is that the majority of these things happened in long-term care centers or hospices. So they said, here's what you want to look at. Now, I remember this from early 2020. There's something that's called goals of care. And from TV, we all understand something similar when people sign a DNR, what's called a do not resuscitate order. In Canada, these are listed under goals of care. So when you are on death's doorstep, if you're terminal already, the last thing that you want to go through is the resuscitation process, because it's violent. And I'd happened to be in a hospital with my mom when one of these things was going on. And I mean, I've taken CPR, and you're staying alive, pumping somebody's a rubber dummy's chest. But when you see this going on inside of a hospital, it is violent, it is brutal, and you can't think of an 80-year-old elderly person going through that trauma. There's you think, what benefit is there? So they changed their goals of care to remove them from that resuscitation. But what it also does is it removes their likelihood of being put into intensive care units. So we'd always seen these broken down as cases, hospitalizations, intensive care, and then mortalities. And when you compare the statistics on how many people inside of those age groups made it into intensive care and how many died, you can see exactly what they're saying. These people were already terminal. The number of them that died in hospices that were considered COVID mortalities, even though they were terminal from something else. And, one of the popular cases happened as they were trying to roll out the jabs for under 18s in Alberta. Our CMOH, Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, had reported a 14-year-old as the youngest COVID mortality in the province when this child had actually died of terminal brain cancer. She ended up having to go out and apologize because the family took to social media and completely ripped her a new one. But again, these two nurses said, we could see by the Hinshaw reports who she was reporting, and we knew who those patients were. She's reporting COVID deaths in terminal patients where people were terminal from one of the, as you said, their comorbidities or their pre-existing health conditions. It was shameful.
It was shameful. As you point out, Sheldon, and quite well, there's been a lot of statistical manipulation throughout this entire pandemic, right? They used it to pump that whole "we're following the science," but it was all manipulation. There has been a lot of fraud. There's been a lot of fabrication. But we have to look at, I'm trying to look at this strategically, because in order to fight this, there's so many manipulations and there's so many bogus studies out there and poorly conducted studies and whatnot. It's impossible to critique them all. So we have to look strategically at which ones to critique and which ones to take down and the role that they played, right? So I start with Fisman's fraud because it's blatant fraud. I can show it's blatant fraud, and it implicates top organizations, top research institutes. And so it is powerful because it shows that there's backing from the establishment. And so I start there. But then I am looking at other, what I consider key studies that you can show other fraud. But right now I'm trying to figure out strategically how to go about picking out the main studies to take things down one study at a time, maybe one researcher at a time, and going that way. So that's where my focus has been. So I start with Fisman. I'm not going to relent on that because he now sits at the helm for modeling future pandemics through the Institute for Pandemics. So even though he committed these fraudulent studies, he's now set to lead the way of modeling future studies, which is outrageous. So this has to be taken care of. We have to do that. But I'm just getting so many calls from people asking me to look at other studies. And it is worthwhile to look at some, but we have to be a little bit more strategic. I see a lot of people spinning wheels. There's just too much to do. So
there's literally hundreds of these fraudulent studies that are put out there.
Well, when you look at garbage studies that happened throughout the pandemic, you're looking at hundreds of thousands. A lot of these studies have similar critical flaws. So you can just, that's one of the strategies I'd like to look at is that you can look at the main tricks. And it would be useful doing that. And I've started logging what are the main tricks that have been used throughout this pandemic. And any study that uses these main tricks, these critical flaws and simple tricks, you can toss them. So you don't have to look at each study individually. You can toss out large swaths of study because they are just critically flawed. Almost every study, basically, that uses like COVID specific stats. We know that, for example, COVID cases, COVID hospitalizations, COVID deaths, they're very subjective. They're very easily manipulated. They're very unreliable. So if you're using a very unreliable measure, the study is not going to really be worth too much, if anything. So you have to look at things, I think, that way, and that's what I'm looking at. And things you're talking about vaccine safety, and I'm talking a lot about vaccine, like the transmission aspect. And when you look at those two things, they were handled very differently when it came to the statistics, right? When you look at transmission, there was an abundance of garbage statistics that were being reported, like a lot. There's an abundance of data when it comes to transmission. Whereas with safety, the whole thing was not to have any reporting. So they handled it in a very different way. And so the strategy for those two things will be different, right? It will be easier with transmission. It will be
Well,
easier because we have a lot of stats. We can show how they're nonsensical. We can show they're unreliable. We can show outright fraud. So that makes our task easier. It's actually more difficult when it comes to safety because they are trying not to collect the data, right? So you have to look at it from a different, have to use a different strategy for that.
yeah. And that's why they say safe and effective isn't one lie, it's two, right? And
Yes.
they're using different methodologies and different tactics to be fraudulent in both of these type studies, on the safety side and then on the effective side.
Right. But it would like what happened with the effective side, they were collecting a whole lot of garbage stats and garbage measures. And then when that no longer worked, then they went to the other way, right? We'll stop collecting it. Just like we don't collect the safety. Now we're not going to look at transmission anymore because it just looks so bad. Um, but I do think, it's really worth looking at things in a methodological way and in a strategic way. And the thing is that it's just overwhelming because there's just so much manipulation that has occurred. So yeah, we have to be very careful how we go about this in order to be impactful.
And on the excuse me, on the important side of this thing, and I know we've talked personally, but just because nobody else really knows you or your background or whatever, you have a sister, and you'd mentioned her earlier on, that worked in the healthcare industry. She was in a cardiac unit, I believe you said.
Yeah, she's a cardiology technologist, or she
Okay.
was one.
And she's not now. And the reason for that is,
Well, when the hospital she was working for brought in the vaccine mandates, and basically, if you did not get vaccinated, you lost your job. You were terminated.
and
Period.
and you're in Ontario, she's in Ontario, and since she's lost her job for not getting the jabs, even though Ontario says, no, we're hiring back our unvaccinated workers, she's still not able to get a job back in healthcare, correct?
Yeah, she hasn't been able to get one at all. Well, not
And
just in healthcare. It's been very, very hard for her.
yeah, and I've heard similar reports. I know a couple of nurses in Alberta that have said the same thing. They're supposed to be hiring us back, but we still can't get jobs in these things. And we're hearing about healthcare shortages, for workers and stuff. We're looking at these mass immigration programs, and accelerating their qualifications. So when a nurse goes through the international nursing training or education, even when they come to Canada, they still have to upgrade some of their knowledge base in order to be considered a nurse, an actual nurse. Until then, they can only get a job as a PSW, or a personal support worker. And personal support workers, like if you are a highly recognized and accredited and educated nurse coming in from another country, you're coming into Canada. The only job that you can actually get in healthcare for the first 2 years that you're here until you upgrade your triage is working in long-term care communities, making about $20 an hour, and what you're doing is changing diapers of elderly people. It's not the reason that these people got into medicine. So, and I knew this from before the pandemic started, because I was working in the staffing industry, and that's exactly what they were going through. We would get people, we would talk to some of these long-term care communities. We'd say we could bring them some nurses, and then we'd find out, and then they'd find out that they weren't getting that at all. They were getting a really good break on pricing for somebody that's an actual trained nurse, but they weren't an actual accredited nurse inside of Canada. So they were getting full nursing staff for $20 an hour as a PSW. So, we're still seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot more of that. They're rushing them through to get their accreditation. Well, we still have Canadians that are benched. British Columbia is the only province, I think it's the only landmass on the planet that still has the mandates for the vaccinations for their staff. And then they've also got what I can call a gag order on their staff. So if their staff see something, but it doesn't go along with the official narrative, they're not even allowed to talk about it. And if they do, they'll be fired. They'll have their licenses to practice removed, and then they'll also face fines. So they have
Mhm.
a gag order with huge penalties, and then at the same time, if they're not vaccinated, don't even apply for the job.
Right. Well, the difference between, I guess, BC, one of the big differences is BC had the mandates, I guess, through the government. Um, Ontario, the government of Ontario did not mandate per se the vaccines in the hospitals, but they allowed the hospitals to bring in their own mandates. So that's the difference. So a lot of these hospitals still have mandates. It's just not province wide. It wasn't the government, but we did have mandates here in our hospitals. It's
Mhm.
just the hospital, each individual hospital decided whether or not they were going to do it, and that is a big problem because a lot of them still are not hiring unvaccinated, workers. And like my sister, she's had a hard time, but there's also another component to that. If you think you can just hire back hospital staff, and they're just going to come running, yes, give us our job back. A lot of them don't want their job back. A lot of them cannot work in healthcare again because they've suffered a heck of a lot of trauma. It has been horrifying for them, and some of them just can't bring themselves to ever work in healthcare again. So even if you open the doors back up to the unvaccinated workers, a good portion of them will not return.
And there is a piece of legislation that was introduced by the Conservatives, and I believe it was in December. And I'll look it up, and I'll put I'll put a copy of that or the link in the Substack or the information, where the Conservatives introduced a an anti-mandate for healthcare workers. I think it was for federal workers, where they said we're no longer going to mandate vaccinations for employment, and it was voted down by the Liberals, the NDP, and I believe even the Bloc hopped on board with that. So one of the reasons that this is still so important, bringing up the fraudulent methodology and knocking down these studies, is because we're not out of this yet. At any time,
Or no.
if they come up with a new word for influenza in at the end of this year, they could mandate another set of jabs for these same workers. And I wouldn't return under the same criteria either. You're either going to protect me because I understand health and this is what I studied. You're going to, remember that we actually have something called an immune system that's kept us alive for our entire lives. That's been evolving for the entire time that, we've evolved from a single cell. Uh, you know, that's what's keeping us alive. So we're either going to start recognizing what actual science and immunology looks like, or I wouldn't take a job under those circumstances either. And that's why I think what you're doing is so important in keeping on top of this and making sure that your book is that much more well known and brought up in every conversation where somebody says, "No, we're going to mandate."
Well, the thing is, yeah, that this study actually cuts to the core of the government's pandemic response, and especially as it pertains to vaccines and vaccine mandates. And I do think this is the best chance of blowing up their narrative and bringing in protections. It shows that they're willing to commit fraud in order to take our right to bodily autonomy away from us. They actually are willing to commit fraud. The fact that this was funded by the government and endorsed by the establishment, by top university, by top journal, it shows we need protections, and that's why I'm not going to let it go, because until we get protections, this could very well come back, and everything's in place for it to come back. I mean, I do believe that if we don't take this down now, we will see mandates again in the future, um, almost surely. So we need to expose the fraud, and we need protections to be put in place. And that's why I'm also happy that they mentioned my book in the House of Commons a few weeks back. I mean, it shows that there's public interest, and it shows we need to do something about this. So I'm going to be pushing that further.
Oh, because
Yeah.
it's just that important. And now we know that the government, well, we could say that they put blinders on to I'm going to call them, just blatant crimes against Canadians. The reckless disregard for life, the forced treatments, the segregation. I mean, those are all crimes against Canadians, and the government as a whole, the 338, are not looking at this. Um, but what do you think citizens are like now? Do you think more people have woken up to the fraud that's been committed on them?
Well, yeah, I think more people have woken up to it. I'm just looking at, why they're doing. When I look at the some of the studies that are coming out now, and I think, are they really fooling people? Um, I don't think so. Like, some people want to believe what the government did was okay and right. And, if they don't want to see it, there's nothing we can do to make them see it. Other people have opened their eyes. When I look at studies coming out now trying to say how great these vaccines are, I don't know if they're really trying to fool people so much as um, just create um, a record so that they can do this again in the future. What I mean is, you look at the study, for example, by Fisman and other studies. It's obviously fraudulent. You, I'm not sure if anybody's really fooled by Fisman's study now. It's very obvious it's fraud. Yet they won't retract it. Why? Because they want to have that in their, as there's a peer-reviewed journal, basically a study saying that unvaccinated are a risk to others. That's it. Whether it's true or false is irrelevant. Whether they're convincing people or not is irrelevant. They get to now point to a peer-reviewed journal as if that makes it true and use it in the future. And so I see studies being used that way. There's the peer review process, the journals, the studies are all being used as a tool for the government going forward. So even like right now, I'm looking in, and the corruption seems very, very open, but they're getting away with it. So, yeah, to your point, yes, I think people are waking up. What are people going to do about it? Right? That's what it comes down to.
Well, and that's really the big question because and I'd pointed this out several times over, and it's even been noted that the Liberal government was tracking our social media and possibly using that information to steer the course of the pandemic. But basically, what they were doing is feeding hysterics through legacy media. They're paying them close to $2 billion a year now to push their narrative. And so they kept people scared. But then throughout the pandemic, you'd notice that there was a lot of these surveys that were being conducted. And the surveys were like right off the charts insane. Should we lock down, or should we, completely prohibit the unvaccinated from, entering these spaces? And so much so to, I think it was New Brunswick or one of the Atlantic provinces had actually looked at banning them from shopping in grocery stores. Quebec had looked at imposing additional taxation, like $3,000 a month for not being vaccinated. So they're using these things, and then again they push the hysterics through the media, tracked the polling, and the more whipped into a frenzy that they could get people, the more crazy that people were willing to do. And I think that people kind of got to that, you know what, this none of this makes sense anymore.
Okay, well, you're mentioning a few things there that are really worth a lot of discussion, and especially when it comes to the polling, because if you look at what went on during the pandemic, back in 2020, in the early months of the pandemic, Canada led the way in implementing the World Health Organization's behavioral insights tool. We led the way. And what that is a series of surveys tracking people's attitudes over time. So it's looking at people's changing attitudes towards the pandemic. It allowed the government to test its messaging, and it actually even allowed them to test like what threshold of government abuse Canadians were willing to tolerate. Okay, so this collection tool was on its 15th cycle by the time the federal election was called. So by 2021, the summer of 2021, 15 cycles had already taken place, 15 survey cycles, and other public opinion polls on top of that, and they were all showing that that the majority of Canadians would back mandates and passports, vaccine mandates and passports. So in the summer of 2021, despite the fact that we knew that the vaccines did not stop transmission, it looked really bad when you look at Israel and other outbreaks throughout the globe. That was very well known, but it was a political winner from Trudeau's perspective. And they had their 70% that they were looking for people to get vaccinated by that time. And if you recall, in the spring of 2021, I think it was on our third lockdown here in Ontario, the government was pushing the whole, oh, get vaccinated. This is when the first dose is being rolled out. Get vaccinated. What we need is 70%. They kept saying that 70% target. Oh, get 70% people vaccinated and we can have our freedoms back and we can end these lockdown cycles and that type of thing. But what happened when they hit that 70% threshold is Trudeau called an election and he made vaccine mandates a wedge issue. And instead of getting our freedoms back, that's when they basically took it all away, right? They
They doubled
converted your
down.
free they converted your freedoms into privileges and brought in the mandates. So yeah, the whole thing was guided by behavioral science, not the hard sciences that most people think of. It wasn't really about safety and efficacy. It was about behavioral science. And that's, I think that did guide. The follow science was follow the behavioral science, and the behavioral science, I believe, fed into the modeling.
Yeah, so for the province of Alberta Health Services released a report in which they'd stated we're not going to rely on new information about COVID, is we're going to work with what we call a behavioral change model. So no, and I've broken down the report a couple times because it's actually pretty amusing. So they'd taken these studies, and then tried to force feed them into their report, saying that conservatives, young conservatives, people that don't trust the government, that's where they're really going to have to direct the messaging to, because we're not going to be the ones that bite on those same apples. So they looked at these behavior modifications and the direct messaging specifically for for conservative. They said liberals and the New Democrats, they're probably going to go along with supporting this. And but when you looked at it, like there was no, the studies that they used, there wasn't a strong enough correlation to support it, but they used it anyways. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's what we have to look at when we go forward in terms of how do we fight what's going on. And we have to understand that they know they were wrong. They know they didn't have the science. They know it. They know they didn't have the evidence, and they know that the evidence doesn't look good. This is not something they don't know. So us showing them that they were wrong and us showing them that the evidence is on their side, that's not going to be enough because they know it. All right. They can pretend they didn't know it initially, but there's no way they don't know it, and they contradict themselves left, right, and center. So we should stop playing that game. It's what are we going to do with the evidence that we have, right? And until you hold specific people to account, I don't see things changing. So we really need to do what we can to hold key individuals to account. So when it comes to the fraud, start with the most obvious example and build a case and bring them to account. So that's basically what my book does with Fisman's fraud. I want him to be held to account, him and his colleagues who committed this fraud to be held to account. And I want to use that to build protections. And he's not the only one. You can branch out. We have the Ontario Science Table here. They've done a lot of poor modeling, but more than poor modeling, I can now go back through the things that they did and pick out studies where they fudged the data. And soon as you can show that fudging or that fraud, then you can move to hold these people to account. And that has to happen because I just do not see changes unless we do that.
Now, here's the other thing is I know, like, for us, average schleps, we don't read the newspaper. We read the headlines. So, and quite often the headline on a news story isn't reflective of what's inside of the report. Now, when there's these thousands of studies that come out from, the pro-vax, pharma sponsored studies, do you think doctors do the same thing? They just look at the bold, they look at the headlines and just assume that the information is correct, and that's what they go through because it had to be flying as fast at them as the information was flying at us. And a good portion of people weren't able to absorb it as fast as it was coming. They definitely didn't read through the entire articles. A lot of people, when they looked at the statistics that were being provided, said, "Oh, no, that looks right," when the statistics never actually supported one, that COVID was a risk to the general population, and two, that the vaccines had any sort of safe or meaningful impact on slowing transmission, reducing symptomology, or curbing death. Do you think doctors fell into the same
Well, I think
into the
a
same
lot.
traps?
I think a lot of the doctors trusted trust the system. They trust the system. And when they're told information, they believe it to be true and they accept it as fact and they go from there. Some doctors probably read studies and looked at the statistics. Well, some did because some went against this. But I think a lot of the doctors a lot of the doctors just believe what they were told and trusted the system. It's as simple as that. And some of these studies are convincing. When I read some of these studies, even I'm like, wow, that almost sounds true. It's not, but some of them are done. No, they're done pretty good. Others not so much. So I think if you just trust the system and do what you're told, and doctors are being asked questions outside their area of expertise. A lot of medical doctors were asked about the transmission. They're asked about what should be done. They're not experts in statistics. They're not experts in risk benefit analysis. They're not even a lot of them are not researchers. They're medical doctors and they know their field. So I think a lot of them were asked questions outside their area of expertise, and that was a problem throughout the pandemic.
And what about
Um,
politicians? Do you think they're the same? I mean, I'm not going to call politicians stupid, but they're not doctors. I mean, we have one. We actually have the shadow minister of health for the federal conservatives. He's an actual doctor. And I tried to write him emails throughout the course of the pandemic after he'd won his seat too, but I'd gotten nothing back. So do you think like politicians fall under the same thing? No, this is what the science says, and they go along with it? Because the few responses that I did get from either members of Legislative Assembly for the province of Alberta or from the members of Parliament, they were like, "Nope, this is what it says," and you could show them the fraud, and they'd say, "Nope, this is what it says." Do you think that they fell under the same traps?
I think it's going to vary. I think some politicians knew what was going on, and you know, especially when I look at what's happening here in the House of Commons lately, I didn't realize that there was a handful of politicians that were against the mandates and didn't fall in line. But you don't hear about them, right? They just kind of get shoved to the side. Um, Most politicians will think politically, and they're thinking about their political careers and what's good for them. So for a lot of politicians, what went on was actually pretty good for them. A lot of them did well during the pandemic. So I don't know whether they believed in the science or not, but a lot of them profited from it, and that was good for them, and they went along with it.
And
Um,
even if they didn't profit, none of them lost a paycheck. They got a raise throughout the pandemic on April 1st, which we now know is coming again for them. And then they got to take part in doing their jobs as a hybrid. So, they're hanging out
oh
in their
yeah,
pajama pants and putting on a shirt and tie.
hmm
Um, you know,
yeah,
same as a lot of work from home people did, right?
right. And the thing is, whether they are new or not, when you refuse to listen to the other side and you refuse to have open discussions, well, you are part of the problem. You can't say that you didn't know if you choose not to know. And you see that a lot with the politicians. They chose not to know, and they did everything in their power to either stay uninformed or or to be able to hide behind that. They like to hide behind we didn't know, but they do that by making sure that you can't talk to them, right? Like when the mandates showed it all. Like when the government brought in its mandates, the federal mandates, and said you either comply or you're out. You know, a lot of federal scientists, the scientists who work for the federal government, they were in that. They didn't take the job, they didn't comply, they were out. So there goes their voice. And even if you had a scientist in there writing letters and saying, "Hey, you're doing the wrong thing," they were ignored and they were cast aside. And I know that for a fact. I know that letters were written and it explained the science very clearly to a lot of these department heads, and they were completely ignored. That just wasn't the game. I mean, it was very political. Everything was political throughout the pandemic.
Yeah.
One of the chapters in my book is, politics dictated the science, and that's what happened.
And I believe 100% of that. So we're coming into about an hour here, Regina. And I want to leave you, a couple of minutes here to just say if there's anything that you think that the rest of us Canadians should be on the lookout for, and it doesn't have to be, the COVID, the science. A lot of people don't want to have a look at the charts, the statistics. Most people don't want to look at a spreadsheet. But from your opinion, as a PhD statistician, what do you think Canadians really need to be on the lookout for right now?
Oh, for right now. I guess one of the things I worry about is that some people think this is in the past, and it isn't. They haven't changed their course of action in terms of what's coming ahead. They haven't. You haven't seen any apologies with respect to the mandates. You haven't seen any acknowledgement that they did anything wrong. So we do need to push for accountability. That's where I'm headed. Some people have asked me, what they can do. And I'm usually a little hesitant to tell people what to do because I don't like telling people what to do. I don't like people telling me what to do. But we have to realize that if we don't do something, it will happen again. So I've been encouraging people here in Ontario to write to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario because, Fisman created a fraudulent study. He is a member of the CPSO, and one thing we can do is ask them to investigate Fisman. A lot of surgeons and physicians here have gotten in trouble for spewing misinformation and disinformation, and we have Fisman, who is a physician who has actually created that disinformation, and he advises the different organizations, so they should look into his disinformation and his misconduct also on Twitter. He behaves in a very unprofessional manner. So that's one thing, writing to them. I tried to have the Ontario Provincial Police investigate this fraud, and they refused to do so. So some people are wondering why, and I say, if you're wondering why, you can always write to them. You can issue a complaint. You can complain to your police department or the OPP, ask for an investigation, because it's easy to ignore one person, me asking for one, but it's very difficult. It's more difficult to ignore like dozens of people calling for an investigation or hundreds of people. So I think we need to be more active, and we will see, I believe we'll see mandates again unless we do something. And that's going to take effort on everybody's part.
Well, that's awesome. Again, I want to thank you for taking some time here with me today, break down the stats. I think that's an excellent message. Be aware that if we're not ready to take some action, this is coming back to us.
Oh, for sure. It's coming back.
All right, Gina. Well, you have yourself a wonderful day. And again, thanks a lot for taking some time.
Thank you, Sheldon.
I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now. I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. can hear it